So having used ColdFusion for a really long time, I have a sort of mental association with ColdFusion component or CFC instantiation being fairly slow, fairly expensive from a processing standpoint. That mental model is probably fairly out of date, but it did make me wonder if ColdFusion component behavior, or some subset of the ColdFusion component behavior, could be implemented with closures. If you think about what a ColdFusion component is, it's public methods that have some sort of internal properties, and all of those things work together to create behaviors. Well, we can do the same thing with closures because closures have lexically bound properties, and the things that we return from closures can have methods on them, and those two can work together in aggregate to create behaviors. So I wanted to, just as a fun experiment, look at the relative performance and cost of creating behaviors with ColdFusion components versus with closures. So let's take a look at what this mock process builder is doing under the hood. So mock process builder is just kind of a standard run-of-the-mill ColdFusion component. It has some internal private properties here. It has some methods here that return this scope for some fluent chainable APIs. We're going to mutate that internal private properties, and then it's going to expose a run method which just exposes the internal state of the component. Now, we're also going to implement the same exact API, right? If we duplicate the code, you can see that this is the same exact API here with this mock process builder, and that's going to create a closure which returns these functions. So let's look at how that closure-based approach is working under the hood. So here is here's our CFC, and it just has the one method, get mock process builder. And the idea here is that we're going to be using local variables, which are now going to be lexically bound to our closures, and you can see that we're returning this API object, and the API object is this struct here in which each key value pair is essentially a method name and a closure. And as I said a moment ago, all of these closures are now lexically bound to these local properties, which of course are quote-unquote private to this particular method context. And then instead of returning this reference, as we did in the ColdFusion component example, we're going to be returning the API reference. The API, again, is this object. So essentially, every time we call a builder style method on the returned API object, we're going to return the API again itself, which will of course then give the calling context references to these closures. So again, same idea, we're mutating those lexically bound private properties, those quote-unquote private properties, and then our run method is simply going to return that internal private state. So if we run this code, which just gets the results through the CFC and the results through the closures, what we can see, let's refresh, is that we get the same exact output, right? Command echo, command arguments ABC, working directory foobar baz, command echo, command arguments ABC, working directory foobar baz. So what we're seeing is that we're getting the same behavior, we are exposing the same API, and now that we know that we're dealing with a sort of apples to apples comparison, let's do a little speed test. So the speed test is simply going to be within a duration window of 2000 milliseconds or 2 seconds. What I'm going to do is see how many times I can instantiate and run the particular approach. So in the first speed test here, you can see that I'm going 2 seconds into the future, and while we have not passed that cutoff point, I'm simply going to increment this iteration count, instantiate my process builder, run it with the arguments, and then get that internal state. We're not going to use it anyway, we're just essentially seeing how many times we can do this. Then we're going to do the same exact thing except using the closure factory. Now with the closure factory, we don't have to instantiate it each time because that's the whole point. We're not instantiating the component, we're using the get mock process builder, I guess I have an R in there accidentally, get mock process builder to generate that closure-based behavior and API. And now if we jump over to the browser, and we run over here, and let's refresh, we're going to wait 4 seconds, waiting, and there we go. So what we can see is using the ColdFusion component approach, we got 100,000 times, and using the closures, we got 131,000 times. So what we can see is that the closure approach here is what, 30% faster? I don't know how to do that kind of math. Let's try it again. So let's refresh, we have to wait 4 seconds, waiting, and done. Again, CFC is 102,000 times in 2 seconds. The closure based 126,000. Let's run it one more time. Waiting, and there we go. 116,000 with CFCs, 128,000 with closures. So when I look at this, I take away two things. One, ColdFusion components are pretty fast. This definitely, I think, alleviates some of the historical burden that I've had in my mind in terms of creating ColdFusion components. 116,000 ColdFusion component instantiations in a 2-second window. That's pretty significantly fast, again, considering how dynamic the language is. The other thing that I'm taking away is ColdFusion closures, super fast, right? It's consistently faster than the ColdFusion components. This one was the closest one we've seen so far, but let's try running it one more time. Yeah, 109 to 125,000. So it's consistently faster. It's consistently faster by a non-trivial margin. Of course, we're dealing with numbers that are huge, so this doesn't, again, necessarily reflect anything that you would see in a production or a typical environment. But again, so my point here is not to say that, oh, we should not use ColdFusion components, that we should use this lexical-based binding closure approach. That's definitely not what I'm saying. Obviously, the developer experience here is very different. The ColdFusion components are clearly much cleaner, right? The style of coding is much easier to understand, much easier to read, much more familiar to people. But what I do take away from this is that for small, cohesive behaviors, creating a behavior with internal properties and exposed public APIs, if that's a small context, using ColdFusion closures, that's totally legit. Not only is it legit, but it's super fast, faster than using a ColdFusion component. So I think there's just definitely some opportunity there in terms of how we implement small cases where we don't necessarily need the ceremony and the isolation that a ColdFusion component gives us. And again, you know, every speed test should be taken with a grain of salt, right? This is not a production environment. This is a local environment. In production, I'm never just iterating over things for 2 seconds trying to instantiate them. So this is really not representative of any kind of real-world use case. But again, let's run it one more time just for funsies because it's Sunday. And here we get 113 to 141, right? So it's super fast. Both cases are fast. Closures are consistently faster in this particular experiment, right? That's not to say that this can be extrapolated to all uses of closures over ColdFusion components, but just an exciting exploration, I think, and just a nice concept to have in the back of your mind when you think about solving problems in the future.